Good evening. I'm Michael Reingold, one of the hosts of tonight's event. On behalf of my co-hosts and childhood friends, John Talata and Alan Paul, welcome. We're so glad that you could join us. As some of you know, my sisters and my mother live in Atlanta, Georgia. And over the years, when visiting them, I've had the great pleasure of spending time with my old friend, Jonathan Rapping, or as we affectionately call him, Raps. I've especially enjoyed meeting his beautiful family, his wife, Illy, daughter, Aaliyah, and son, Lucas. Thanks to these get-togethers, I, like Alan and John, have actively followed the important and innovative work that Raps and Illy have done in creating Gideon's Promise. These past few months, I've also organized and participated in numerous Zoom gatherings of old friends from Pittsburgh. These have been a silver lining of the pandemic. In each gathering, we were reminded how lucky we are to have grown up in a warm, supportive community with so many friends who are fun-loving, interesting, funny, smart, accomplished, and most importantly, nice. But our gatherings were not just about the past. They were also a chance to catch up with each other and to support each other. With this in mind, Alan, John, and I wanted to gather our old friends, as well as other guests, to hear and support our buddy Raps, and to hear his and Illy's story and the Gideon's Promise story, and to learn how Gideon's Promise is impacting thousands of lives and reshaping criminal justice. We are proud of our friend and classmate and encourage you to purchase Raps' book. It's important and inspiring. A few quick logistical details. Please keep yourself on mute during Raps' talk with Alan, but feel free to use the chat to connect with each other. We will be recording the event. We suggest you put your Zoom on speaker view. We will have questions and answers at the end of the program. And after the questions and answers, we invite everyone to stick around and talk with each other. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Illy Askia, Raps' partner in life and the co-mastermind behind the creation of Gideon's Promise.
Thanks, Icky. Hello, everyone. Hello, Pittsburgh. And those of you who are no longer in Pittsburgh and everywhere else, but you know, once you're there, you're a Pittsburgher at heart. I'm a Buffalonian at heart. So I am so happy to share this screen today with all of you. My name is Ilham Askia. I have the distinct honor of introducing Raps and Alan this evening. I also have the distinct honor of being the executive director and co-founder of Gideon's Promise. And as you all know, Gideon's Promise recruits, trains, and mentors public defenders all across the country working in under-resourced communities where I grew up. This work in this criminal justice reform movement is extremely personal to me. I was introduced to the criminal justice system when I was 5 years old. And I was told or shown that people that look like me, people who came from poor communities that I came from, did not matter. And I was taught that through a public defender. When I was 5 years old, I came home from kindergarten and I was told by my mother that my father would be going away for a while. My father was sentenced to 10 years in Attica Correctional Facility, which is one of the worst state institutions in the country. My father's departure completely dismantled my family. We had challenges throughout my entire childhood. And what I learned about the criminal justice system, that poor brown people like me, men and women, simply didn't matter. My husband's public defender never told the value, I'm sorry, not my husband, oh my God, not my husband. My dad's public defender never told the value that he had, the impact his departure would have on our family. His public defender never said that my dad was accused of crimes and allegedly did those things, but he had completely changed his life around. He married my mom, he had 3 small children and 1 on the way. But before he could even tell his story, my dad was ripped from our home and we did not see him for 10, 15 years. And so for me, I was raised through the prison system. I spent most of my formative years being parented, being fathered through bars. And so this work to reform criminal justice, this work to support public defenders who are coming into this work because they really want to help people. They really want to tell their stories, but the passion is quickly beaten out of them. And they become part of the process to process poor brown and Black people into cages. And so for me, as a former educator and now a criminal justice reformer, I dedicate my life to make sure that no other little girl has to witness and watch what happens to her family. No other little girl has to understand the pain of what it feels like to visit your dad and look at him in a green jumpsuit. And so I devoted my life and changed my careers to really support the very agents of change, which are public defenders. So I have the distinct honor tonight to introduce you to two very, very important people, and one that just recently popped into my life, who is Alan. And I do believe that it is crucial in this very moment in time, this very unique moment in time, to have these open and honest conversations of what is happening to poor brown and Black people in this country. Public defenders are the change agents. They are the storytellers to say that father, the husband, the brother that was my dad has value, that he matters, and public defenders humanize those who are accused. And so I didn't trust public defenders when I first started. When I first came into my profession, I didn't trust them because like I told you before, they introduced me to a system and I thought they were part of the problem. But over the years, working with John, working with public defenders in the Deep South, I started to really see that they were growing up professionally in a system that has taught them to process people. And so I devoted my life and my career to make that change. And so I am so thankful for all of you for joining Alan and John this evening. And so the world knows him as a musician, as a New York Times best-selling author, but you all know him as Alan Paul. The world also knows the second person as a MacArthur genius, a criminal justice reform innovator. You know him as Raps. I know him as the love of my life. And so I want to take this time and introduce you, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's program, to Alan Paul and Jonathan Rapping.
Thank you so much, Illy. I don't know if I can possibly follow up that incredible introduction. Thank you. I really appreciate everyone being here. I'm really honored to get to talk to John, and I'm so pleased to see so many of our old high school classmates. So some of you may remember I was the freshman and sophomore class president of Taylor Alderdice, and then with Tommy Kramer, and I was defeated by John, and he very ably partnered with Terry Hughes, and they beat us. And I tell you, nothing speaks to the intelligence of the class of 1984 Alderdice than that decision. He was, and I'm not saying that to be self-deprecating, there's absolutely no doubt that John was the right man for the job. Not that there really was much to do, but if there had been, he certainly would have done it better than me. And I say that in all sincerity. In the last couple of years, John and I have really reacquainted, or become closer and spoken a lot more, along with some other friends, including John Talata. And I'll just say, which has been really a wonderful part of the last few years. These have been difficult years for a lot of us, and that's been something that's been a bright light for me and helped me stay focused and positive and enthusiastic. So I recommend it to everyone to keep reaching out, and I hope that this event can do a little bit of that. And what really spurred this, to make sure everyone knows, is that John has this great new book out. It's called very simply Gideon's Promise, the same name as his organization. And John, his book is wonderful, it's great. And I just want to make it clear, and I think you all will understand this when you hear John talk more. It's a heavy topic, as Illy so wonderfully and personally detailed. But it's an encouraging, optimistic book in a way, because that's how John is, and that's how John and Illy are running this organization. So, John, let's just talk about that a little bit. I mean, it seems like one of the things you really believe is that public defenders are critical to having justice in our society. And I'm wondering how you came to that conclusion, and how you decided to dedicate your life in the way you were going to better the world by becoming a public defender and then improving the system of public defenders.
Yeah, Alan, first, let me just say to you, to John T, Icky, thank you guys for putting this together. Illy, way to kick it off. I married up, as you all now know. And also, I got to say, just as I was watching the squares pop on the screen, I'm just kind of reminiscing. I'm getting nostalgic, going back, man, 35 years or more, to see so many people who really, shaped my life. We all kind of shaped each other's life when we were young. So let me just say, I've been excited for this night, and thank you all for joining. As to your question, Alan, I came out of law school and I started as a public defender. And it was really my introduction to something I didn't completely appreciate. And that is that we have a criminal legal system that targets certain communities based on race and income. It overcharges and over prosecutes those communities. It over punishes those communities. And should those folks come out of prison, they are oftentimes unable to even participate in life because they can't return to their homes, they can't vote, they can't return to many jobs, they can't get educational loans, they can't get public benefits. And so what I really realized as a public defender was that our criminal legal system is sort of the latest manifestation of 400 years of a nation that has embraced a narrative that says some people don't matter. And what I really, as Illy so I think poignantly pointed out, right, that it's not just the people going through the system, it's their children, it's their families, it's their loved ones. And what I came to understand is that you good people can go into a system that is so cruel and inhumane, and before you know it, you start being shaped by that system, right? You start to go along with the processing without even realizing it. And before you know it, you're not even calling people by their names. People are case numbers. People are files. And what I really came to believe was that the key to making us realize the wrongfulness of this system is forcing us to see the human beings behind the cases, the human beings impacted. It's why when Illy tells her story, it moves so many people because it introduces you to people, families that are impacted. And the reason why I came to really see public defenders as needing to be centered in this conversation is because public defenders represent 80 to 90% of the people in the criminal legal system. And collectively, they have the power to learn those stories, to tell those stories, to amplify those voices, to infuse the systems with humanity, and to ultimately change the narrative when they're working in partnership with those communities. And I wanted to write a book that really, I think, was accessible to everyone, not just lawyers, not just academics. It was a very accessible book that helped them understand that these unsung heroes every day are critical, deserve, and need support.
You were working, how many years did you work in the Washington Public Defender's Office?
So I was there, I spent a couple years there as an investigator while I was going through law school. John Talata did the same thing. I then came out of law school and spent a decade there before moving to the South to start doing this work here.
And what prompted you to go to the South? Was it a drive to go where you felt more needed, or was there a specific job in Atlanta that first brought you there?
No, so when I got asked to come to the South, to Georgia, it was 2004. At that time, I was the training director at the DC Public Defender Service, which is a wonderful model public defender service. It was, I thought, the best job I'd ever have. I was married. My daughter Aliyah was 6 months old. Illy and I had just bought a house. I didn't think I'd ever leave DC, and I had no interest in leaving DC. But a very dear friend and someone who's been a role model to me for a long time, a man named Steve Bright, had been fighting this fight in the South to try to actually establish a statewide public defender system in Georgia. Prior to 2005, there was no public defender system in Georgia. There were 159 counties. Every county decided how to give poor people lawyers. Some had public defenders, some had private lawyers who just bid, the lowest bid got the case. And they started a statewide public defender system, and Steve Bright asked if I would consider coming down to be the training director. And to me, it was like a once in a lifetime opportunity. So I asked Illy, she said, hell no. I asked her again, she finally said, okay. We came to Georgia for what proved to be the first of 3 once in a lifetime opportunities.
And some of the stories you tell in the book about what you were confronting when you got down there, and some of these cases that you had mentioned, I think there was a lawyer who took on cases for $50 a case, basically just lined people up and pled them out. And then, you know, you've done this work in Mississippi and Alabama, and there's some of the stories there are just incredible. And so how do you remain so optimistic and charging forward while looking into the belly of the beast, or wandering through the belly of the beast? Because I think it's something that some of us struggle with in far less trying. You know, we're not dealing with anything remotely like you are day to day. And I think it's one of the things that's most inspiring about you. I hope that everyone that's here and people are interested in this specific issue, but even bigger than that, I think it's something that we all need in our lives, not just how to keep pushing forward and fighting the good fight in whatever field it might be.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. I mean, I will tell you, I think what I've learned in doing this work is if you view success as actually achieving the justice that people deserve, you can go through life feeling inadequate. I believe we're going to get there, but I think it is a long game. And so I've really learned to understand that success happens in bites. Success happens in steps. And the more people we can gather to start to take those steps, the more we can have success. There's a story I tell in the book, and I share it, I share it often when I speak, and it's a story about, Illy and I built this organization, Gideon's Promise, really to try to build a movement of public defenders in places that never respected public defense, and to try to build offices that were very client-centered, to change the culture of offices. And we start the program by bringing a new class of lawyers together each year. And those young lawyers go through a 3-year process of training, mentorship, support, community building. But it starts with a 2-week boot camp. And we used to meet in Birmingham, Alabama. And I tell the story of how we'd go through these 14 intensive days. And at the end of those days, at the end of the 14 days, all these public defenders, young public defenders, didn't know each other 2 weeks earlier, now felt like family. And we would sit in a circle and share parting words before they left, and they would talk about how they felt like they were going to change the world. And then they'd go off to their offices in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, Louisiana. And within a few weeks, 2-3 weeks, my phone would start ringing. All of our faculty who served as mentors would get the same calls. And the calls would all go something like this. They'd say, "Hey, Rap." So after I got out of law school, the S dropped off, and now everyone calls me Rap, but it's Raps because I grew up with you all. "Hey, Raps." So I think I'm going to quit. I now understand what every person deserves, and I can't give it to them. I've got 300 cases. I feel defeated. And I always share with them a story that comes from a book I read called Freedom Summer, written by Bruce Watson, about that amazing summer project in 1964, where young folks from across the country, right, college students, came to Mississippi to partner with courageous freedom fighters, civil rights workers in Mississippi to register people to vote. And Bruce Watson tells the story through the voices of the people who were there. He interviewed them, albeit 40 years later. And through these stories, you learn that these young folks went to Mississippi thinking they could change the world. And they started knocking on doors. And one after the other, doors would be slammed in their faces. They'd be told, "I can't be seen talking to you. My life could be in danger." And as the summer went on, you learned their hope turned to despair. They started saying, "Maybe my family was right. Maybe I can't make a difference. Maybe this doesn't matter." And Bruce Watson fast forwards 40 years to a conversation with Congressman John Lewis, who we love dearly, who was one of the architects of Freedom Summer. And he was a dear friend of Gideon's Promise. And Congressman Lewis says, if it weren't for Freedom Summer, Barack Obama wouldn't be in the White House. Quite literally, he was saying sometimes change is so incremental, those most involved in it don't even realize that's what they're doing. And when I get that call, Alan, what I always say to our young lawyers, I tell them that story, and I say, when you stand up in court and the judge wants you to just sit down and shut up and process cases, and you say, "Judge, I'm not doing it today. I'm not participating today." When you do that, you may not get the result the people you serve deserve, but when you do that, and your colleagues are doing it in a courtroom next door, and another group in the next county over, and another group in the next state over, collectively, you're raising expectations about what justice means for poor people. Collectively, you are changing the world, even if you don't see it in that moment. Being surrounded by those folks, Alan, it can't help but keep you optimistic.
You write a lot in the book about your family, and obviously, as we now know, Gideon's Promise in some ways is so intertwined with your family, and you and Illy run it together. But how do you think the work you've done has influenced you as a parent and influenced your family and your family life?
Yeah, so I was actually hoping that my children, Lucas and Aliyah, would come down and say hello. They were supposed to join Illy, but I think Aliyah fell asleep after a long day of mock trial, and Lucas has been doing lacrosse all day, and I think he's on the PlayStation. But
can you imagine having to go against her in mock trial?
I've already done it. I've lost every time.
The other kids should get like a couple points to start.
Every time. But no, so my kids really were raised with Gideon's Promise. My daughter was 6 months when we started doing the work. My son, when he was born, we already had a community, and we get together every 6 months. And my kids show up every 6 months. And one thing we do at Gideon's Promise is everyone gets up and they share what the 6 months have been like. And we give each other applause and support. And my kids get up and share. And it's not an exaggeration to say this community raised my children. And I bring my children to Gideon's Promise. The reason Illy and I do that every 6 months is because these are the people that we want to be our children's role models. We bring our children so they can be around adults who teach them the values we teach. And one thing I learned, I was giving a talk in the campus of Ohio State, and I had breakfast with a group of law students who were interested in criminal justice. But one of them said to me, I really want to be a public defender, but I can't afford to. I said, what do you mean you can't afford to? He said, yeah, I've got 3 kids. I just can't afford to. And I said to him, one thing I've learned as a parent is it doesn't matter how much money you make. If you are not living the values that you espouse to your children, they will see you as a fraud. There is no amount of money you could pay me to not ensure that my children are growing up with the values that we talk about every day. And so to me, being a parent, doing Gideon's Promise is part of being a responsible parent. I can't really imagine raising my children and talking about the things we talk about. There's Aliyah. Wait. Speak up, Aliyah, so you can come on the big screen.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Aliyah.
Where's Lucas?
I think he's upstairs. I can tell him to come down.
Whenever he gets a chance.
Okay. Hi everyone, nice to meet all of you and see all of you.
So, and I'll tell you, one of my proudest moments is, during the rallies, as there were sort of uprisings around the country. There was an effort in Decatur, Georgia, Decatur Square. Some friends of ours were leading the effort to take down a Confederate monument that, African Americans had to walk past every day to go to the courthouse. And there were, over 1,000 people there. And Aliyah was invited to speak because she was part of a group called Teens Looking for Change. It was a group of teens of color in Atlanta who were trying to figure out how they fit into this moment because they recognize this is a moment for young folks to fix the mess we left them. And Aliyah got to speak at that rally to thousands of people. And if anyone wants to see it, it's a plug for her, but it's also just amazing. You can go YouTube, Aliyah, Decatur, Black Lives. Check out Aliyah and you will see how proud having my kids as part of this has made me.
Well, and John, you were brought in, not as directly, but in a way you were inspired to this whole life and your life of being an activist, I would say, by your parents. And you tell a very moving story, almost it's like on the first page of the book, I think, of how the experience you had as a very young child in a courtroom. And I would you just tell that story as written? Because I think it's very moving and incredible. And of course, it's a tribute to your parents who were doing the same thing that you're talking about doing with your kids.
Yeah, so I did. I grew up in a very activist household. My parents were Jewish activists. And my mother was really active in the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement. And so we would go to demonstrations quite a bit when I was a kid. I think I was probably 6 or 7. We were at a demonstration and a group of friends of ours got arrested. And my mother brought me to court because they were friends. It was my first time in court. I was, like I said, 6 or 7 years old. And I went to court to see these friends of ours. And I remember I was raised to have a very healthy dose of cynicism about authority even then. And so I took my water gun and I put it in my waistband to go to court. Back then, a 6-year-old couldn't get thrown in jail for having a water gun in his pants. So I went into court. And I remember we were sitting in this courtroom and watching these proceedings. There were a group of Pittsburgh activists who were being charged. There were police surrounding the courtroom, and all of a sudden the lights went out. And there was scuffling. You could hear noise. And when the lights came back on, my mother's shirt or coat was ripped. Her coat sleeve was ripped. And that was my first experience in a courtroom. And I remember very clearly that was my understanding that courtrooms are not always places where justice happens. They're not always places where righteousness happens. And I remember thinking that if I had to be in the front of that courtroom, I wanted to be one of the defenders of the people who were my friends, not the people who were lining the courtrooms and abusing the protesters.
Right, and you took from that, not I'm never coming back into a courtroom, but I'm going to come back into this courtroom and fix this, be on the right side of things. And
I don't know if I quite directly connected the dots from 6 to now, but certainly it was a step.
And I see Lucas just joined us there with Illy, and since I see him and you're talking about when you were a kid, it reminds me. You also tell a very moving story about going to the courthouse with him in Washington D.C. after a visit to the African American History Museum. Would you mind relating that one as well, because it's also very powerful?
Yeah. So let me tell that story, and then I'll introduce y'all to Lucas. Just probably a year or two ago, about 2 years ago, when Lucas was 10, he's 12 now. Illy and I decided to take our kids to DC to check out the National Museum of African American History, which is an amazing museum. And it's a museum, if you haven't been there, it starts in the basement 400 years ago, 1619, and you start to work your way up these ramps through history, seeing sort of African American history. And it's hard to even do in a day. We spent about 4 hours there, got to about the 1960s, and we decided to come back and finish the next day. So we left and we got lunch. But my kids wanted to see the courthouse where I started practicing. So me, Lucas, and Aliyah went to the DC Superior Court. And we sat down in a courtroom where they do what's called first appearance hearings, where they're people who were arrested the day before are coming to court for the first time. And I'm sitting there with Lucas and Aliyah. I knew the judge. I knew some of the prosecutors and some of the defenders from my days in DC. And they started calling cases, and a young black man, hands cuffed together, chained to a belly belt, would come out. 30 seconds or so, they'd be on to another case. Another young black man. After 5 or 6 of those cases, Lucas turned to me. He's 10. He turns to me, he says, "Dad, this is like that museum." And it struck me that for a 10-year-old child to recognize that what was happening in that courtroom was more akin to slavery or black codes or Jim Crow than anything that looked like justice. While there were judges, prosecutors, defenders who I knew them to be good people, but they had been in that courtroom day after day, and they had become resigned to the status quo, right? That was eye-opening to me about the power of culture. So Lucas, I wonder if you could shout out and say hello, man. Everyone says he looks like me. Is this what I look like when y'all knew me?
The brown version of you?
The brown version. With more
He's
hair.
better looking, bro. He's better looking.
Your dad did have hair. I know you might not believe that. Most of us had hair back in the day.
Yeah, it's true. We weren't all always bald, Lucas. We did have.
Lucas and Aliyah.
John, since we're seeing Jeff and Jimmy there, that gets me back into an alternate way of thinking. And You know,
And I'm waiting for a dance party to break out.
Yeah,
Actually,
I know. So, you know, as I'm sure you know, the right to marry really came out of Alderdice. I mean, Evan Wolfson and Billy Rubenstein, who was at the ACLU Right to Marry Fund. I mean, they really pioneered this as a legal thing. And the fact that this is just now an accepted thing in America, really, and in much of the world, comes out of Alderdice. And you come out of Alderdice, obviously. What do you think it is about our background? I mean, is that a coincidence that so many great social justice legal minds and lions, you might say, have come from our school and our neighborhood? Or what do you think?
so I mean, this is a theory. My theory is as good as anyone else's theory on this call. But I do. First of all, I also want to say, Evan Wolfson. We give out a Lifetime Achievement a year each award. A few years ago, we honored Evan Wolfson for his achievements. And, we grew up around the corner from the Wolfsons. Michael and I were good friends since we were little kids. But I do think it's not coincidental. I mean, I know some of you saw the sermon I gave where I talked about this. I believe that there is a history that we have as Jews of sort of knowing and experiencing oppression and sort of understanding our commitment to stand up when we see oppression. And there's clearly a history in this country that African Americans understand all too well, a history of oppression. And African Americans have helped to build this country in every single aspect of it. And I think the thing that was beautiful about Alderdice, at least for me, was I felt like I was in Squirrel Hill as a Jewish kid in a Jewish community in a school where so many of my best friends, so many of my colleagues were African-American kids from Homewood, from East Hills, from East Liberty. And I really feel like the sort of, there was an understanding. There was a marrying of these two histories that happened. It was subtle. I don't feel like we were talking about it all the time. But as I got older and looked back, I really did understand that the things my family would talk about when we talked about Jewish history and an experience of oppression were the same things that my friends of color were talking about, and that they were talking about in their households, and that when I'd visit their households and meet their parents and talk to them, that they were talking about. So I think those two influences combined to really drive a lot of us to see an obligation to try to make the world a better place.
But you were always a special guy in regards to reaching out to people and having friends across all racial and ethnic classes in a way that most of us didn't do. And, and I think that's reflective of just I guess just who you are and who your parents were and how much awareness you had of things that a lot of us didn't. Some of us have taken decades to come around to seeing things that are going on. And I was also struck just really early in your book, another thing, when you give the number, I think it's since 1970, there's been a 700% increase in incarcerated people. And that has to make me reflect, that's pretty much my lifetime, like you, like a lot of people here. I was born in 1966. So you talk about since 1970, that's my lifetime. And it's something that I certainly have been aware of, and I, say the words mass incarceration and whatnot, but I don't think I ever really sought and would say, what's the most significant thing that happened in my lifetime in America? Well, we now incarcerate, whatever percentage of the world's prisoners. And so I guess it's better to be woken up to it all and at 54 than never. So thank you for everything you've done to bring that to attention. But I think that the term mass incarceration is important, and it's what we need to know what's going on. But the actual numbers are just shocking. They're just mind-boggling, and it really puts it in perspective.
Hey, Alan, can I just share one more quick story? As you say that, it makes me think. I mean, not only have we gone from 250,000 people behind bars in the 70s to 2.3 million people behind bars. All else being equal, you are 6 times more likely to end up in the criminal legal system if you are Black, than if you're white. And certainly raising a black son has brought a level of awareness to me that, you know, that even adds to anything else my life experiences have taught me. And I will say one thing that's interesting. Lucas had an experience in 5th grade. We're fortunate. We are comfortable. We're well off. And so my kids went to public school, and it was a predominantly white public school. Lucas was the only black boy in his class. There were other black kids in his class. He was the only black boy. And they had a substitute teacher. And the substitute teacher came in, and some of the kids were playing around. And Lucas is a really respectful kid. Coaches love him, teachers love him, but she didn't know any of them. They were like 10. They were playing around. And she points out Lucas, and she says, "If you're not careful, son, when you grow up, you're either going to end up dead, in jail, or on drugs." And Lucas understood exactly what that was about. And I remember Illy and I talked to Lucas, and we told Lucas that we were actually really happy that he had that experience in that environment where everyone loves him and he's got support and they know who he is, because he's going to have those experiences through life. And we don't want the first one to be when he's not surrounded by people who love him and care about him. And as a white father raising a black son, I have to say, I realized, years ago, that how I move through the world, right? I mean, if I run a stop sign, or if I curse someone out who cuts me off, when my son is with me, I can't do that, because I can't model for him the way I can move through the world. I've had to think about how to model how he's going to need to move through the world, because I understand how cruel this justice system is going to be to him if he makes a mistake that someone who looks like me could make and walk away from unscathed.
Right. And I know Roger Schrading just said a hello in the chat. I don't know if you know Roger, is Eric's brother, another great Squirrel Hill guy, and he said solidarity from the Philadelphia Public Defenders. And I know there's a few, I think, of Roger's colleagues here as well. And John and I were talking about that earlier today, and I know that your head of the office here, Keir Gray, I believe is the name, is someone that John thinks very highly of. So it's good. It's encouraging to know that there are offices, hopefully, that are maybe don't need Gideon's promise as much as others, so you can focus on the places that really do.
Yeah, Philly PDs are bringing it. So if there are Philly PDs on the call, shout out to you. I'm sending love. I love Keir, but I have a lot of friends in that office. Y'all are doing great work. Appreciate you.
In this moment where people outside of the activist community, outside of, I guess I'll just say the activist community, are becoming more aware of these issues, at least tangentially. I mean, people will fight forever about what Black Lives Matter means, but I think that your perspective is so important, because that's what saying a life matters. It means just as much that you treat them someone with respect, that you would treat family with respect, that someone wouldn't have to have this experience like Illy did when she was a kid. And I think that is becoming more widespread and understood. And yeah, that's controversial and people are fighting about it, but there's so many more people that are understanding that. So in this moment, how does that affect you and your work and your office, or does it, or do you just keep doing your thing regardless? Yeah,
so I got to also say, I'm just looking at the chat here, and I'm loving, I forgot to say, Illy did go to the school, and that substitute teacher is never going to teach at that school again, and I think everyone's afraid of Illy. But aside from that, so as far as the question goes, I mean, I do think, in this moment, right, there's a pandemic. We're all kind of stuck inside. We're watching television more than normal. We are focused on these brutal killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and there are uprisings happening, right, where people really are finally recognizing that certain communities, Black and brown communities, are not treated the same in the criminal legal system. And the focus tends to be on these high-profile killings. I think what public defenders understand, and what we constantly try to help other people understand, is that those brutal killings in the street are not disconnected from another violence, a more routine violence, an invisible violence, a normalized violence that happens in the court system every day. It's a violence that happens when there are no cameras on, no cell phones, no CNN. It's a violence that happens when people are held pre-trial on money bonds they can't pay, losing their jobs and sometimes their homes just because they're poor. A violence that happens when people are overcharged because of who they are, over-sentenced, denied the ability to have a trial. Like less than 95% of the cases in this country ever make it to trial because the cost of trying to assert your rights have been made so high. That violence is only interrupted by a strong, well-trained, passionate public defender system. And while they have something like that in DC, in Philly, in New York, in most of America, it doesn't exist. And so I think it is really important that we connect the violence that we are talking about every day, which is, it deserves all of the spotlight it's getting, but we have to connect it to a more routine and visible violence that 5-year-old children like Illy all across the country experienced all the time when no one's watching.
It's also was sort of mind-blowing to me that before 1963, I think it was, with the Gideon case, there was no system of public defenders. So before that, did people just literally, I mean, had no attorney? And can you, so that's just, I don't know, a lot of people probably don't know, that's where the name Gideon's Promise comes from. So could you just explain that case a little bit and what the situation was before that?
Yeah, so prior to 1963, without getting all like law school professor about it, but prior to 1963, there was no right to have a lawyer in state courts. The Sixth Amendment was understood to apply in federal courts, but not in state courts. The Sixth Amendment is the amendment that says everyone's entitled to a lawyer. And so in states, some states had public defender systems. They chose to give people lawyers. Some didn't. Clarence Earl Gideon was in Florida where there wasn't a right to have a lawyer. He was convicted without a lawyer, wrote a letter to the Supreme Court saying this isn't fair. Supreme Court took it seriously. It was a very different Supreme Court back then. It was a Supreme Court that was understood to be very protective of civil liberties and defendant rights. They gave him Abe Fortas, who's perhaps the greatest lawyer of all time, later a Supreme Court justice. They won the case, and Gideon says anyone in state court has a right to have a lawyer if they're charged with a crime. Gideon went back to court with a lawyer and won, right? Which shows the importance of having a lawyer. But the other thing significant about Gideon that I want to point out is that Gideon was decided in 1963, and it can't be understood in a vacuum. 1963 was the same year as the March on Washington. It was the same year of the 16th Street church bombing in Birmingham, where 4 little girls lost their lives. It was the same year of many civil rights milestones. It was an era when we were grappling with the deprivation of civil rights in education, in commerce, in voting. So Gideon was a civil rights case. It was decided along with other civil rights cases at a time when civil rights legislation was being passed. It birthed public defenders as civil rights warriors. It made a promise that no one would go to court without an advocate who could make sure that their voice was heard and their rights were protected. And that promise has never been fulfilled. The name Gideon's Promise as an organization is because the lawyers we are grooming, we are building up, are that promise fulfilled?
So I want to make sure we said this at the beginning, but if anyone has a question they would like to ask John, you can throw it into the chat. Before we wrap it up, I want to make sure everyone has a chance, and if you do have something. And I want to take another second to plug John's book. I think you have an idea from listening to him talk, if those of you who didn't already know him, what the book is like, because it's one of the great things about your book, John, and it's really well written. It's really conversational, and it very much is like the experience that you're having right now in a book form. Your voice comes through, and people will pick that up. I see my cousin Julie Tamarkin just put in there, how can we support his work? So John Talata is gonna jump in at the end and give some details, but basically you can go to gideonspromise.com anytime and donate. The links are at the top of the page. Also, I should say, John has a
I
great.
just posted them just now.
Okay, so they're at the bottom of the page as well now. And part of one of those links is a podcast. So for those of you who like to listen rather than read, or maybe do both, it's also really great. And there's always ways to help. What I've done with Gideon's Promise, and you should do it for someone, if not them. If you shop on Amazon, you can go to Smile Amazon, and you can link them as someone to get, and they get like 2% of your sales or something. It's a small thing, but it's something to do, and I couldn't recommend the book more. John, my wife Rebecca asked if you would describe your most memorable case.
Well, so I mean, I have a lot. There's one, I talk about a couple in the book. I never talk about cases that are victories because, quite honestly, I think a lot of lawyers do that. We get into kind of bragging about victories. I think my most memorable cases are cases that remind me of how cruel the system is. And I think one of them was my very first case. It was a 15-year-old boy. He was 3 days shy of his 16th birthday when he was at his best friend's home. They were playing with a gun that was owned by someone in the home, and the gun accidentally went off, killing his best friend. And the next day, I was appointed to represent him. And I walked back into what was called lockup, the cells behind the courtroom. And I met this young man, and I couldn't even have a conversation. He was comatose. He was like he was just grief-stricken over the role he had played in the death of his best friend. Like there was nothing the system was going to do to this young man that he hadn't already suffered from being involved in this awful crime. He had never been in trouble before in his life. He was a good student, and he was charged with murder. Fortunately, 3 days shy of his 16th birthday, so he was in juvenile court. And I remember we went to trial, and there was no jury in juvenile court. The judge found him guilty and sentenced him to juvenile life, which meant he would go to a hellhole outside of DC called Oak Hill till his 21st birthday. He'd spent 5 years in hell, and all of his aspirations, all of his hopes for life completely crushed. And I remember when he walked out the back to go to the cell, I walked out the front, walked across the street to my office, walked in my office, turned out the light, closed the door, sat at my desk, and I just cried, right? I cried. I just thought to myself, I picked the wrong profession, right? I'm not cut out for this. This work is too hard. It's too hard watching terrible things happen to people you come to care about so deeply. And I thought about quitting, but I was surrounded by all these amazing, supportive people that reminded me that there is value in being by someone's side in their worst moment in life, that matters. I've never forgotten that lesson, and I spend my days trying to help young public defenders who feel defeated like I did remember the value of being there when someone feels like they've been abandoned.
Tracy Fisher asked, do you have any volunteer opportunities? And I think Illy just responded to her in email, but that's good to just put it out there to everyone. And I saw, I answered for how can we support the work about donating, but that really should be your answer too. So sorry to, if there's anything else you want to add to that.
No, except I do want to say, so Tracy is one of our Alderdice people who's now in Atlanta. And Tracy, we've got to get—
Tay!
Hey, all my Alderdice family and Pittsburgh family.
So I got to get together with my Atlanta Alderdice crew. No, I think whatever Illy is saying, I mean, donating, obviously, I mean, we spend our days begging for dollars, so that's always helpful. But we do events, and I hope when this pandemic passes, we do something in Pittsburgh. But Tracy, you're in Atlanta, and we have opportunities here, so let's connect.
Okay, definitely, John. And then, your kid, what grade is your middle school baby in?
Lucas is in 7th grade.
Okay, because one of them plays sports, right?
They both do.
I was looking forward to them playing bunch.
It'll
we'll
happen.
talk offline.
Awesome.
John, Icky has a question. Can you describe the scene at some of the public defender's office when you first got to Georgia and New Orleans, and how that's different than the culture you're trying to create through Gideon's Promise?
Man, so I think Icky might be thinking about a particular story I told him, although it's not an unusual story. So after spending 2 years in Georgia, Katrina hit, and I went to New Orleans to help with the effort to rebuild that public defender office. And I walked into a courtroom in New Orleans for the first time. And New Orleans was like the worst public defender system I'd ever seen. I walked in a courtroom and there were people everywhere in suits. You didn't know who the defenders were. You didn't know who the prosecutors were. No one was standing at a particular table, right? You knew the judge was because he was up on a bench with a robe, and you knew who the accused were because they were shackled in orange jumpsuits against a wall. And the judge takes the bench and he starts calling names, and he'd call a name and a voice would sort of float up from a suit. You didn't know what suit the voice belonged to. No one in a suit ever stood next to anyone in an orange jumpsuit. And within 10 or 15 seconds, they would move on to the next one. And the judge would call a name, and the processing just went on. And then a judge called a name, and there was no voice. Judge looked over to the orange jumpsuits and said, "Is Mr. So-and-so here?" And a man stood up. Judge said, "Where's your lawyer?" The man said, "I haven't seen a lawyer since I got locked up." Judge said, "Well, how long you been locked up?" The man said, 70 days, 70 days. Judge said, "Thank you, sir. Sit down," and went on with the processing. And what shocked me more than the fact that a man was locked up for 70 days without a lawyer was that literally no one in that courtroom was fazed. Not the judge, not the prosecutors, not the defenders who were tasked with speaking for the people in the jumpsuits, right? It was my introduction really to the power of culture, and really had a lot to do with our thinking about how we were going to build and design this movement that we've been now fueling for over 13 years.
John, Marla Norris had a question, which is
Marla.
Speak on how privatization retards the effort of public defenders.
So, Marla, I got to say, if I'm understanding you correctly, do you mean the privatization of prisons or the privatization of the defense function? Can I ask Marla?
Prisons.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as a general matter, right? Our criminal legal system, like any other system, is a profit-based system, and so there are judges and prosecutors who run for election in most parts of the country. They get campaign donations from bail bond companies, right? Which in turn cause them to use money bonds more. They get donations from private industries that now run jails and prisons, right? And right in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, there's a documentary called Kids for Cash you can watch, where several years ago there were judges who were literally promising to send juveniles into prison beds in exchange for cash contributions. So absolutely, I think that when you start mixing profit into the justice system, you start to stray from justice. I mean, we could talk about that, Marla, all night long, but that's the short answer.
Jim Lando says, the epidemic of mass incarceration, which you describe, has largely occurred after the Gideon decision. What role does the legislature and commercialization, you just sort of covered this actually, of the prison industrial complex play in this tragedy? And what upstream measures can we support so that you and other PDs can stop having to fish people out of the river?
Yeah, man. So yeah, I think it is connected. I mean, obviously I didn't talk about this, but politicians also run and get donations from people that have an interest in fueling a large criminal legal system and fueling mass incarceration, and they participate in the laws they pass. Look, I think there are a lot of solutions. There are a lot of people working on policy fixes, changing laws. Our view, I think what Illy and I have come to understand is you can engage in all the policy change you want as long as we see some people as others, as inhuman. We will work under whatever rules, whatever structure, whatever policies exist to continue to oppress those people, whether it's the structure of slavery or black codes or Jim Crow or mass incarceration or whatever comes next. If we're not simultaneously working on an effort to change the way, the hearts and minds, the way we see people who have never had a voice in society, I believe all the other policy fixes in the world are going to fall short. And so we see public defenders as the vehicle to shift that narrative and amplify those stories in the current system where the damage is primarily being done. And I think investing in those storytellers, those truth tellers, has to be a critical part of any solution we engage in.
Yeah, and part of that, I just finished reading this book, Cast, by Isabel Wilkerson, and I would really recommend it. You don't even have to read the whole book. You can listen to interviews with her, but it lays out some of the structural reasons for why, people, brown and black people have been seen as the others, and it will help you understand how some of this can happen. It's a structure. My wife asks, what advice would you give to young people who are interested in this kind of work? Which either my daughter actually asked that or she asked it on her behalf, hint, hint, I'm not sure, but it's a good question. Generally, all of us have kids, not all of us, many of us have kids of age starting to think about what they might do with their lives.
So, my paying job is I teach law school at a law school in Atlanta called Atlanta's John Marshall Law School. And this is a story that will resonate with lawyers, but non-lawyers as well. I do orientation for our first year students. And John Marshall's a law school that's about 50% students of color. It caters to a non-traditional law school population. And when our students come in, I always say to them, why are you here? Right? Why do you want to be a lawyer? And they have these idealistic answers. They want to serve certain communities, address certain issues. And I go on to share with them a quote from an unnamed law student that says, the first thing I lost in law school is the reason why I came. And I go on to tell them that you're going to enter a first-year curriculum where we will teach you the law can be reduced to rules and doctrine, to black letters on a white page. Before you know it, you will forget there are human beings behind these cases. And I challenge my students. I say, I challenge any of you at the end of your first year to come to me and tell me the story of one person behind one of the many, many cases you've read. They can't do it because that's not part of the law school education. And I tell them that it's the beginning of a process, and it happens in education, it happens in medicine, it happens in every profession. It's the beginning of a process where we start to dehumanize the profession, right? It's mechanical. It's not about human beings. And so what I say to my students is, your challenge over the next 3 years more than anything is figuring out how you get through this experience without losing sight of your purpose, right? Nothing's sadder than a professional in any profession that doesn't have a purpose. And so what I would say to young people is the same thing I say to my law students is look for organizations that are doing the work that is purposeful to you. Look for mentors who are doing work that's purposeful to you. Stay connected to people who inspire you. And whatever you do with your education, make those relationships and regular connections with those people a part of your education so you don't get off the path that brought you here in the first place.
John, Ella Davis asks if you've worked with PDs in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, we did for a minute. We had a very brief connection with a couple of PDs in Pittsburgh, and then for resource reasons, that connection sort of dissipated. So we don't currently do any work in Pittsburgh, but I would love to get back to Pittsburgh for many reasons. So if anyone has connections in the public defender office and you think you can inspire them to partner with Gideon's Promise, let us know.
As Susan Beckerman made a comment, it's not a question, but I think it's a good one, which is, I know it to be true. Another consequence is that where these huge prison complexes are sited in rural areas away from where the inmates come from, they're counted in the census for that rural area, further reducing services and representation to their home communities, reallocating them to the places where the prisons are located. And I just thought that was worth throwing out there for everyone to hear, because that's a real issue. David Rosenblatt asks, what do you think of New York State's bail reform, and is it the model you would advocate for nationally?
Yeah, so David, I have to say, we don't do work in New York, and I don't want to claim it all to be an expert on the bail reform in New York. I know that in New York City, where I'm connected to some of the public defenders there was a lot of success early on in bail reform, and ending money bail for a lot of different offenses, but my understanding is the law enforcement, the police union, and the prosecutors really very successfully took some cases where things didn't go well and have beaten that back. But again, I can't say that I'm an expert in exactly what's going on there. At the end of the day, my view is we should do away with money bond, right? There is no reason why someone should be in jail simply because they can't pay a bond. Whereas if that person had money, they could go home and be with their loved ones. There are systems of preventive detention that don't involve money, that look at the dangerousness of a person. And there are all sorts of models around that, and they have their own problems, but no one should ever be held simply because they can't afford a bond.
So guys, I have one more question here from Stephanie Cantor-Ratner, but in case anyone else has one, throw it in there before we wrap it up.
Go, Stephanie.
And also just to note, so make sure you see this, John, Ken Haber said he would love to host a Pittsburgh event for the private and public bar as a fundraiser and educational opportunity for you. So get in touch with Ken Haber.
Ken, send me your email. I'd love to get in touch with you.
I will do, John. Absolutely.
Thank you.
This is great.
And Stephanie's question is, where do you see Gideon's Promise in 5 to 10 years?
So a couple things. One, we are in the middle of a capital campaign. One thing we really hope to do in the next 5 to 10 years is to literally build a public defender training center, right? Bricks and mortar, where every public defender in the country has a home where they can come to get training, to get community building, to get reinforcement. Right now, we go to different hotels and conference centers to do our programs. And as we've gone from our first class was 16 lawyers from 2 offices, our last class was 70 lawyers. Our community gatherings now are hundreds of people. It's getting really expensive. So our hope is to have a home where public defenders can gather. That's the capital campaign. But also, I don't know if 5 or 10 years, but certainly maybe 20 years from now, my hope is that I think the model of public defending that we teach, right? It's embraced in a number of offices like Philly, like DC, like some of the New York City offices, but in far too many places it's not. It's a model that we call client-centered representation, where public defenders see themselves as servants to the communities that they serve, and their priority is amplifying those voices and not substituting their judgment for the judgment of the people they represent. And I would love to see in 20 years, every public defender office in the country embracing a training, mentorship, and development model like the one we've developed from Gideon's Promise. No one should have a lawyer that doesn't respect their dignity and their voice and their choices.
And Susan Morrow asks, she lives in Chicago. She says Chicago has been a disaster for so long. Is there anything happening there?
We don't work in Chicago. There is a relatively new public defender there, Amy Campanelli, who, I think is pretty good, but it's also a huge system and a huge bureaucracy. But no, I'm not doing work in Chicago, and I actually can't say that I'm an expert in what's happening in Chicago. So I don't know, Susan, that I can really shed light on that.
All right, I think I'm going to say thank you to everyone. John, is always enlightening and fun to talk to you.
Can I ask a question?
Really a pleasure.
Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to ask a question. It's Ick here. Sorry about that. Raps, if you don't mind. I'm nearly done with the book, and I'm loving it, really loving it. Even though I've been hearing your stories, as we've stayed in touch over the years, reading it, it's bringing it to life. It's emotional, it's personal, it's great storytelling. But the question in the back of my mind is that as I'm reading it is like, why is the training for public defense after these students, after people have gone through law school, why do they have to then go through this training? Isn't it ever part of law school that they just learn this stuff? I'm just confused by the education that's not happening. And maybe I don't understand how law school works in general, but I know we have some law professors on the show here.
Yeah, so my answer, and I maybe law professors have different answers where they teach. That's not what law school teaches you, right? I mean, law school does not focus, some law schools have clinics where they actually have very good clinics, and it's sort of like in your third year, now you can represent human beings and learn how to do it well. But your first couple years, you're not really learning how you actually deal with another person's life. And even in clinics, so one thing I'd say about clinics, I did a clinic, I had 3 clients, I learned how to represent 3 people really, really well. And then I went to the South and I met lawyers with 300 cases. No one in my clinic would have been able to go to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi without being paralyzed, because no one taught them how you take those skills and you transfer them to a really broken system where now you have to figure out how to incrementally move the ball forward as a change agent. That's not taught in law school. What we're really teaching is how do you go into a system that is broken, interrupt it, and start to have a vision for how we move towards justice. And that's just not something you learn in law school. I also see Josie asked about the CFC Combined Federal Campaign. I don't know if
I answered that already, honey.
Oh, thank you. Because I was going to say.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. So my boss, John Tallada, who's on the board. I'm like, yes, you can. You can donate through CFC.
I was also, one last thing I want to say. I pulled out my yearbook and I was going to threaten to start reading things some of y'all wrote, which would be really embarrassing, but I'm not going to do it. But if you want to know what you wrote in 1984, holler at me.
Rap, there's some parents who are actually on. Some of your parents are on this call. I don't think they want to know that. I do not think they want to know. Let them stay in the blue pill. They want to stay in the blue pill world.
My parents probably already know it all anyway.
I think John Tallada is going to come on and say a few words, but I just want to say before we're done, John, thanks again, and Illy. You guys really are inspirational. Somebody just said that in the, I think it was Ella Davis. And John, make sure when we're done, you take a minute to read through some of the comments, because aside from the questions, there's a lot of nice comments. And you guys really are inspirational for the work you do, also as a couple and the way you collaborate. It's what we all need to do to support one another. You guys do it very literally, but it's, we're nothing without you. And, you're really inspirational. And John's going to give you some more information about how to support, but I think anyone who's seen this should have a feeling that it's something really worth doing. And just again, it's not just, this isn't like a textbook. I loved Cast, and it was a great book that really helped me understand America better, but John's book is better as a read. And that's a best-selling, very renowned book. It's just a great book. It's full of heart and soul. So I think you should not only buy it, but you should buy it and send it to someone else in your life who needs it. And with that, I turn it over to John Rapping. John Tallada, sorry.
Thanks, Al. Well, I'm just so grateful to be a part of this event, to just see all the faces. It's truly wonderful. And I'm going to try to say a few things to put this in perspective before I give you the ask that I'm going to give you. I think I'm a lawyer. I've been practicing for 20 plus years now. I work in a law firm, and I do a lot of work in the social justice area. John is the lawyer that I wanted to be when I was in law school, and I didn't have the guts to do it. It's just that simple. What John and Illy do is what law students think about and dream of doing, and most of us end up in some other place. The great story here is that I came around through my law firm work, and we're back together again, and it's a wonderful thing. But when I listen to John and Illy tell their stories, it gives me hope, and I hope it does the same for you guys, because there's no one better than these folks. This is what it's all about. And I think in hindsight, listening to the discussion tonight with John and Alan, it's not surprising that John would start an organization like this, and that it would be a huge success, particularly given that John married up, and I did too. So it's a fair accusation. But in a little perspective, just to before I give the ask, just for how I got involved in this. This isn't just a Squirrel Hill thing for me. John and I reconnected in DC back in the 90s after college. He was in law school. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And as John mentioned, I had worked as an investigator at the Public Defender Service in DC before John did. And I enjoyed watching John. John became a legend at the Public Defender's Office in DC. He's a little too modest. And it's also the model organization for the country. So what he learned and then what he shaped and what he drove, that's what he's taking to the national stage now. And over time, while John was fighting the good fight, particularly in the recent years as a social justice warrior with Illy, I started spending a lot of time on pro bono cases, and I do Innocence Project cases and social impact cases. So John mentioned, Louisiana. I've been involved in some lawsuits down in Louisiana to try to raise funding through the state. It's an impossible task, right? That's why what John and Illy does is so important, because these folks they're not going to get training, and they don't learn it in law school, and they need the training. It's vital. And I think, over the years, I've tried to support Gideon's as much as I could. And earlier this year, they asked me to serve on the board, which is one of the great affirmations for me as a lawyer to be honored to do that. I already knew several people on the board from past times in my life, from law school and from work. And it's just a wonderful organization, as I think you all can tell from listening to John and Illy talk about it. So I have a vested interest here now, right, in this cause. It's not just my friend and his amazing wife, and it's not just my cause that I'm interested in. It's my new family. And the whole idea tonight was to try to introduce this new family to you all, because you all are our original family. It's where we came from. Like all things in the criminal justice system, the warriors need help. The funding's scarce, the resources are scarce, and it's shocking. I mean, read John's book, look around. There's so much to be done. And I can't tell you, these Innocence Project cases that I work on, they break my heart. I see the aftermath of a broken system that John's trying to fix. I get the cases where people are actually innocent. And it's not always because a public defender wasn't trained properly or they did something wrong, but you just see that if they had a lawyer that had more training, maybe there had been a chance to get this right. This is what John does. This is what Illy does. This is what they need to do, because they're not going to get it locally. They won't get the training locally. So, we sit at home and we think about, there's so many problems, there's so many things that need to be done. Where do I start? Well, if you're looking and you want to make a difference with your contributions, then I think you should really, read the book, check out Gideon's page, talk to me, talk to John, talk to Illy, ask questions and help, right? Listen to the podcast and learn. John's a teacher. You can see it, you can see it in tonight's event. He's got so much information. He's got so much thought. Illy's the same way, and they have experience and they have background. And it's just a wonderful organization to support, and I hope you can, whether it's buying the book, listen to the podcast. Someone put up a question about volunteering. Send Illy an email. I guarantee you, there's lots to do. She will help you find something to do. But in the end, you got to give, because the truth is that the funding drives the training, and the training is what this is all about. If we don't have the money, we can't train the public defenders, and the system's never going to get better. It's that simple. There's no amount too small, but of course, large amounts make us really happy. And but anything that you can do, I have to tell you, I've been involved in a lot of different nonprofits over my life. I serve on another board on a related type of organization. But Gideon's is, for me, it's always been an organization that I've admired, not just because of who John is, not even just because of who Illy is, just because of what they do and how important it is. And the truth is that most of us here, we're never going to have to worry about it, because most of us had the means. If we had gotten in trouble, we would have gotten a lawyer. We'd have found a way to have a lawyer. This isn't about us. This isn't about what we can do to help ourselves. This is about what we can do to help people that can't help themselves. And so I'd ask you to just, let's think about how the amazing information that we got tonight and the ideas that John and Illy have. And if you can help, please do, because it's a wonderful organization and we're doing great stuff.